The entire history of New York City? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a place you may already know, or at least you've seen it in a movie. New York City. The city that doesn't sleep, which is ironic because you're listening to this to help you sleep. Don't worry, we're not going to keep the energy of Times Square. No neon lights, no honking cabs. Just a quiet, slow wander through centuries of human chaos, all piled up where Manhattan now sits. So take a deep breath. Maybe dim the lights, tuck in, and let's begin. Because New York City is one of those places where history didn't so much unfold as it stumbled, tripped, and face-planted into the present day. Let's start long before skyscrapers, before Wall Street, before I Heart NY t-shirts. Picture the island of Manhattan as it once was. Forests, streams, wildlife. Quiet, except for birds, wind, and people who actually knew how to live there without ruining everything. The Lenape. They'd been living in the region for thousands of years. They fished in the rivers. They grew corn, beans, squash. They didn't blast holes in the ground to put up luxury condos. They lived in longhouses, had seasonal camps, and generally got along without needing a subway schedule. Of course, this didn't last. Because eventually, Europeans arrived. And when Europeans arrived anywhere in the 1600s, it was almost never good news for the people already living there. The Dutch were the first to really plant their flag in the area. They showed up in 1609, when Henry Hudson sailed up what would be named very modestly the Hudson River. He was working for the Dutch East India Company, which tells you everything you need to know about his priorities. Exploration, trade, profit. The Dutch thought this place looked promising. There were furs to trade, land to claim, and opportunities to annoy the English. Always a bonus. So by 1624, the Dutch had set up shop. They called the place New Netherland, and the little trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan became New Amsterdam. Yes, the same name that would later become New York. But don't picture tulips and charming canals. New Amsterdam was more mud than majesty. A few wooden houses, a fort that was already falling apart, and a population that was, let's be honest, a bit of a mess. Soldiers, sailors, traders, a few families, and eventually, some enslaved Africans brought to do the hardest labor. Because of course they were. Now, one of the things the Dutch were famous for was paperwork. They loved contracts, charters, written agreements. So naturally, they decided to buy Manhattan. According to legend, they got it for beads worth about $24, which sounds like the greatest real estate deal in history. But it wasn't quite that simple. They gave goods to one group of native people, who probably didn't even live on Manhattan, and thought they had a contract. Meanwhile, the Lenape just thought they'd agreed to some kind of trade relationship. It was less, we surrender the island forever, and more, you can crash here if you want. But the Dutch weren't really known for subtlety. New Amsterdam grew slowly. It was not glamorous. People complained about the mud, about the lack of proper beer, about farm animals running loose in the streets. One director, Peter Minuit, is remembered for organizing the whole land purchase thing. Another, Willem Kieft, is remembered for being absolutely terrible. He decided to wage war on the local native people in the 1640s because apparently things weren't chaotic enough. It was called Kieft's War. It went badly. The colony was nearly wiped out. He was eventually fired, which was the best decision the Dutch West India Company made that decade. Then came Peter Stuyvesant. You might know the name because they've slapped it on everything from neighborhoods to cigarettes. Stuyvesant ruled New Amsterdam from 1647 until 1664. He was nicknamed Peg Leg Pete because, yes, he had a wooden leg, and yes, he decorated it with silver nails. Subtlety, again, was not the Dutch forte. Stuyvesant was strict, religious, and not exactly fun at parties. He enforced laws, he tried to clean up the colony, and he clashed with just about everyone. The trouble was, while the Dutch were trying to turn their muddy outpost into something livable, the English were watching. And the English were not the type to just let their rivals have a prime bit of coastline. So in 1664, English warships appeared in the harbor. Stuyvesant stomped around, waving his wooden leg, insisting they should fight. The settlers looked at the ships, looked at their collapsing fort, and said, "No thanks." The Dutch surrendered, without firing a shot. Just like that, New Amsterdam became New York, named after the Duke of York, the brother of King Charles II. Because nothing says reward like slapping your little brother's name on a stolen city. Now here's the thing. New York didn't suddenly become an English paradise. The Dutch didn't all leave. In fact, Dutch families stayed for generations. They kept their language, their traditions, their waffles. Yes, waffles. And they slowly blended into the English colony. Meanwhile, enslaved Africans remained because, unfortunately, the English were just as committed to that system as the Dutch had been. Life in colonial New York was fine. Not spectacular, not terrible. The city grew, merchants traded, farmers farmed. The population rose slowly with a mix of Dutch, English, German, African, and eventually Irish and Scots. It was multicultural before that word was fashionable. Of course, most of these groups disliked one another intensely, but that's new. York for you. Diversity plus irritation. By the early 1700s, the city was still relatively small, maybe 5,000 to 7,000 people. Imagine that. New York, with a population you could fit inside a modern sports arena. It had crooked streets, wooden houses, and taverns everywhere, because if there's one thing that never changes in New York, it's that someone is always drinking in a crowded, noisy space. But New York was also a place of sharp inequality. Wealthy merchants built brick mansions, poor workers crammed into tiny houses, and enslaved people by the hundreds were forced to do the dirtiest, hardest jobs. In 1712, tensions boiled over. A group of enslaved Africans set fire to a building and attacked whites who tried to stop them. It was quickly put down, and the punishment was brutal. Dozens executed, some by horrific methods. The city responded, as cities so often do, by passing even harsher slave codes. So not exactly a golden age. As the 18th century rolled on, New York became a bustling port. Ships from the Caribbean brought sugar, rum, and enslaved people. Ships from Europe brought goods and immigrants. The city became a middleman in the Atlantic economy, feeding Britain's appetite for wealth. It was growing into a place that mattered, though it was still rough around the edges. By the time the American Revolution came knocking, New York was a city of maybe 25,000 people, which was for the colonies a lot. But remember, today that's about the size of the line outside a bagel shop on Sunday morning. The Revolution was not kind to New York. In fact, it was occupied by the British for most of the war. Washington lost the Battle of Brooklyn in 1776, retreated across the East River, and basically said, well, that's gone. The British moved in and stayed until 1783. For 7 years, New York was a loyalist stronghold. The British turned it into a garrison town filled with soldiers, refugees, and prisoners. At one point, a massive fire destroyed much of the city. No one knows exactly how it started, but it gave the place a scorched, miserable look. When the British finally left, New York was battered, burned, and bitter. But ironically, that's when things started to get interesting. Let's drift over to the next era. New York in the early Republic and 19th century, the British have just left. The year is 1783. Imagine New York at that moment. Burned-out buildings, muddy streets, a few battered churches, and residents who've spent years under military occupation. Not exactly a charming picture. Still, people celebrated. George Washington rode back into the city to mark the British departure. It was symbolic, dramatic, and awkward, because the city was still half in ruins. But this is new. York we're talking about. And if New York has one superpower, it's bouncing back, loudly, with a bit of attitude. After the Revolution, New York briefly became the capital of the United States. Yes, really, in 1789, George Washington was inaugurated there as the first president. He stood on the balcony of Federal Hall downtown and gave his oath of office. You can picture him in a powdered wig, looking extremely dignified, while trying to hide the fact that his dentures were probably slipping. The city hosted the first sessions of Congress, the beginnings of a new government. And then, just as quickly, the capital moved to Philadelphia. Because New York was already getting on everyone's nerves. Still, the city was on the rise. Its harbor was deep, its location was perfect for trade, and its people were stubbornly ambitious. By the early 1800s, New York was competing with Boston and Philadelphia to be the city of the young republic. And then came the project that changed everything. The Erie Canal. Ah, yes. The Erie Canal. Completed in 1825, it stretched from Albany on the Hudson River all the way to Buffalo on Lake Erie. Nearly 363 miles of muddy ditch, dug by exhausted workers, many of them Irish immigrants. It was nicknamed Clinton's Ditch, after Governor DeWitt Clinton, who pushed for it. Critics called it a waste of money. But when it opened, suddenly New York City was connected to the Great Lakes, the Midwest, and beyond. Goods poured in. Grain, lumber, produce. Everything could flow to Manhattan, where it was shipped out to the world. Almost overnight, New York became the busiest port in America. Boston sulked. Philadelphia sighed. New York shrugged and said, "We win." Now, more trade meant more money, and more money meant more people. Immigrants arrived by the tens of thousands. Irish fleeing famine, Germans escaping political chaos, Italians, Jews from Eastern Europe, all funneling into the city by the mid-19th century. Ellis Island wasn't open yet, that came later, but Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan served as the main entry point. Imagine the sight, families with their luggage, exhausted from weeks at sea, stepping into a city that was already overcrowded and smelled questionable. Life for the rich and poor could not have been more different. On one end, Fifth Avenue began to sprout grand mansions. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, families with names that sounded like bank accounts, built palaces of brownstone and marble. They threw balls where guests changed outfits several times a night, because apparently one dress wasn't enough. On the other end, the poor crammed into tenements. Dark, airless, rat-infested buildings on the Lower East Side. Families of 6 or 8 in a single room. Bathrooms shared by dozens. Disease spreading faster than gossip. Reformers would later describe these conditions with horror. At the time, city officials mostly looked the other way. After all, the poor weren't attending their dinner parties. Of course, in between these extremes, New York politics flourished. And by flourished, I mean rotted. Enter Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran the city like a family business. Tammany was famous for corruption, patronage, and getting things done, badly, but effectively. They handed out jobs in exchange for votes. They controlled elections with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. The most infamous figure was Boss Tweed, of the 1860s and 70s. William McGeer Tweed, a large man with a taste for diamonds and cigars. He ran the city's finances like his personal piggy bank. At one point, he and his cronies managed to steal, by some estimates, the modern equivalent of billions of dollars. Contractors overcharged for everything from courthouse construction to street cleaning, and Tweed pocketed the difference. He was eventually exposed by journalists and cartoonists. Thomas Nast's famous political cartoons made him look like a greedy, bloated vulture, which, to be fair, wasn't far off. But here's the thing. Ordinary New Yorkers often supported Tweed anyway. Because while he stole millions, he also handed out food, coal, and jobs. He made sure immigrants had a place in the system, however corrupt it was. Better a crooked friend than an honest stranger. Meanwhile, the city kept growing. By the mid-19th century, New York had over 1 million residents. Imagine that compared to its humble Dutch beginnings. The skyline was still low, but things were changing. In 1858, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux designed Central Park. Finally, a green oasis in the middle of chaos. Though, of course, to make space for it, the city evicted entire communities who already lived there, including Seneca Village, a largely African-American settlement, because nothing says progress like bulldozing someone else's neighborhood. Then came the Civil War. New York, being a northern city, should have been solidly Union. But remember, it was also the financial hub for Southern cotton, and many business Elites weren't thrilled about the war. Draft laws made things worse. Wealthy men could pay $300 to avoid conscription. Poor men, many of them Irish immigrants, could not. In 1863, anger exploded in the draft riots. For several days, mobs rampaged through the city, attacking the wealthy, looting, and, tragically, turning. Their violence against black residents. Homes and businesses were destroyed. People were lynched in the streets. The military had to be called in to restore order, leaving over 100 people dead. It was one of the darkest moments in New York's history, and it showed just how divided the city really was. But again, New York bounced back. By the late 19th century, it was not just America's biggest city. It was the city. Immigrants kept arriving. Ships lined the harbor. Factories churned out goods. The Statue of Liberty was unveiled in 1886, a gift from France, standing tall in the harbor, as if to say welcome. Though good luck surviving your tenement. Ellis Island opened in 1892, processing millions of newcomers. Inspectors checked eyes, teeth, papers. Some were sent back, most allowed through. Families carried everything they owned in a few battered trunks and stepped into the city of dreams, which often turned out to be the city of disappointment. And through it all, the city grew upward. Steel-framed buildings began to climb higher than anyone thought practical. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883, connecting Manhattan and Brooklyn with a span so daring people thought it might collapse. To reassure the public, officials marched a parade of elephants across it. Because nothing says trust the bridge like elephants. By 1898, the 5 boroughs, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island, were officially consolidated into Greater New York. Brooklyn sulked because it thought it was doing fine on its own. Thank you very much. But together the new metropolis was unstoppable. So by the turn of the 20th century, New York was loud, filthy, crowded, corrupt, and magnificent. It was already what it remains today. Too big to ignore, too messy to fully love, and too fascinating to ever forget. Let's drift forward into the next century. New York in the 21st century, 2010s. Hey everyone, tonight we're staying close to the present but still letting the past drift through. We've reached the 21st century, which for New York has already been, let's just say, eventful. And like always, the city has handled it in its own unique way, loudly, unevenly, but somehow still standing. Let's start at the obvious place. September 11th, 2001, a date that needs no introduction. The morning began like any other. Commuters squeezed into subways, coffee cups balanced in one hand, newspapers in the other. The World Trade Center towers, massive and stubbornly plain, rose into the late summer sky. Then, of course, everything changed. 2 planes struck the towers, and within hours they collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The city was covered in ash and silence. It's strange to talk about. New York is silent because silence has never been its thing. But on that day, silence was everywhere. Streets below Canal were choked with debris. Dust clung to faces and clothes. For a few hours, even New Yorkers, the most famously impatient people on earth, moved slowly. They helped strangers. They stood together. The towers were gone, but the grief wasn't. For years afterward, the city carried that weight. You could see it in the makeshift memorials, in the flowers taped to fences, in the flags draped from windows. Every anniversary since, bells toll, names are read, and the wound, though quieter, is still there. But New York has never been a city that pauses too long. It mourns, it complains, and then it gets on with things. Even within weeks of 9/11, the city was reopening. Restaurants in Lower Manhattan served meals again. Wall Street rang its opening bell. Broadway staged shows because if New York is going to collapse, it will collapse while singing and dancing. The reconstruction of ground zero was naturally complicated. Arguments about design, politics, money, because of course there were arguments. In the end, the site became the National September 11th Memorial and Museum and One World Trade Center, also known as the Freedom Tower. It opened in 2014, gleaming and tall. At 1,176 feet, the height was a deliberate nod to American independence. Subtlety, as usual, was optional. But let's step back to the early 2000s, because the city's story wasn't only about tragedy, it was also about transformation. This was the decade when gentrification went from a buzzword to a way of life. Neighborhoods that had once been affordable, if a bit rough around the edges, were suddenly filled with yoga studios, wine bars, and apartments advertised as cozy at $3,000 a month. Williamsburg, Brooklyn became a laboratory for ironic facial hair and fixed-gear bicycles. Longtime residents rolled their eyes. New arrivals called it authentic. And landlords called it profitable. Elsewhere, Harlem, once the beating heart of black culture, began changing too. New coffee shops, expensive condos, and rising rents pushed out families who had been there for generations. Queens and the Bronx saw their own shifts, though often less celebrated by glossy magazines. Still, for all the complaints, gentrification also meant less crime, better schools, cleaner streets. Though, as any New Yorker will remind you, cleaner is a relative term. Speaking of crime, remember how the 1970s and 80s made New York sound like a disaster movie? By the 2000s, that reputation was fading. Crime had dropped dramatically in the 1990s and continued to decline. Suddenly, tourists could walk through Times Square without immediately being mugged, propositioned, or both. Of course, the trade-off was that Times Square became a glowing monument to chain restaurants and cartoon mascots. Locals avoided it, like the plague, and honestly, they still do. Politics in the city during these years was dominated by one man, Michael Bloomberg. Billionaire businessman, founder of Bloomberg LP, occasional Republican, occasional Democrat, but always rich. He served as mayor from 2002 to 2013. His style was technocratic, data-driven, and, how shall we put this, mildly paternalistic. He banned smoking in bars, pushed for calorie counts on menus, and famously tried to ban oversized sodas. Because, in a city where you can buy a skyscraper with cash, the real threat, apparently, was too much Pepsi. Bloomberg's defenders praised him for stabilizing the city's finances, improving infrastructure, and overseeing a massive drop in crime. His critics accused him of running New York like a corporate boardroom, ignoring inequality, and supporting aggressive stop-and-frisk policing that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino communities. In true New York fashion, the truth is probably somewhere in between. Messy, complicated, and not particularly polite. The 2000s also brought cultural moments. The city bounced back artistically as it always does. Broadway thrived, off-Broadway thrived, museums expanded, galleries moved from Soho to Chelsea, then to Brooklyn, then, inevitably, to wherever the rent was cheapest that year. Hip-hop, born in the Bronx in the 1970s, had by now gone global, but New York rappers still carried its legacy. Jay-Z, Nas, 50 Cent, these names defined a generation, and then came the financial crisis of 2008. Naturally, its epicenter was Wall Street. Lehman Brothers collapsed, the markets tumbled, and once again the world was reminded that New York bankers have an extraordinary talent for breaking the economy. The city braced for another Great Depression. Layoffs spread, bonuses shrank, though somehow not by much. And Occupy Wall Street set up tents in Zuccotti Park in 2011 to protest inequality. The encampment became a symbol of resistance, though eventually, the police cleared it out. The tents disappeared, but the slogan, "We are the 99%, lingered. By the end of the 2000s and into the 2010s, New York was a paradox, as usual. Safer than it had been in decades, cleaner, richer, but also less affordable, less accessible, and in some ways, less authentic. The city that once prided itself on grit and oddness was turning into a luxury brand. Developers built glass towers along the skyline, often purchased by absentee billionaires who rarely lived in them. Locals joked that the best thing about these apartments was the view into someone else's empty penthouse. And yet, the energy was still there. Immigrants continued to arrive, now not just from Europe, but from Asia, Africa, Latin America. Queens became one of the most diverse places on Earth. Walk a few blocks in Jackson Heights and you'll hear half a dozen languages, smell spices from 5 continents, and probably still trip over a delivery bike. This was New York in the first decade and a half of the 21st century. A city that had endured trauma, reinvented neighborhoods, embraced both billionaires and bodegas, and somehow made all of it work, though often badly. Let's pause here, because the next chapter brings us even closer to the present. The 2010s, the pandemic, and everything after. New York in the 21st century, 2010s present. So, we left off with New York in the early 2010s. Bloomberg had just finished his long mayoral reign, Wall Street had melted down and dusted itself off, and the city was looking shinier than ever, though increasingly too expensive for most of the people who actually made it interesting. Now we step forward slowly, into the second half of the 2010s and beyond. Politics and leadership. Michael Bloomberg stepped aside in 2013, leaving behind a city that was safe, rich, and, depending on whom you asked, either brilliantly managed or suffocating under technocratic control. Into this walked Bill de Blasio, who had run as the anti-Bloomberg. His campaign ad featured his teenage son Dante, with a giant afro, promising a mayor who understood inequality. It worked. New Yorkers elected de Blasio, partly because he promised to focus on regular people rather than billionaires, and partly because New Yorkers will always vote for whoever annoys them the least that year. De Blasio's 2 terms, from 2014 to 2021, were polarizing. He pushed for universal pre-kindergarten, which parents loved. He talked endlessly about A Tale of Two Cities, which was fair enough since anyone could see the contrast between luxury condos in Midtown and the crowded apartments of Queens. But he also developed a knack for annoying nearly everyone, from police unions to progressives, often simultaneously. A true New York talent. Still, his mayorship overlapped with years of big national debates, race, policing, housing, and New York was always center stage. Policing and protest, the NYPD, remained one of the largest and most controversial police forces in the world. The stop-and-frisk policy, in which officers stopped huge numbers of mostly Black and Latino men on the streets, came under heavy fire. Courts eventually ruled it unconstitutional, and the city scaled it back. But the mistrust lingered. By the mid-2010s, New York saw major protests echoing national movements. Black Lives Matter marches filled streets after high-profile police killings. Thousands of people gathered in Union Square in Brooklyn, outside police headquarters. New York has always been a city where protest is practically a civic duty, so none of this was unusual. What was unusual was the sheer scale and the way smartphones broadcasted every moment in real time, culture and everyday life. But politics isn't the whole story, because if you want to understand New York in the 2010s, you also have to talk about food, fashion, and housing, those 3 pillars of constant complaint. Food. The city went through an era of food crazes so fast it was hard to keep up. Cupcakes, cronuts, rainbow bagels, ramen burgers, $20 avocado toast. It was less about eating and more about Instagram. Naturally, pizza remained the eternal baseline. You could still get a slice for $1, which was the one true equalizer between Wall Street bankers and broke college students. Fashion. New York remained one of the world's fashion capitals, which is ironic because the average New Yorker still mostly wore black, comfortable shoes and an expression that said, "Don't talk to me." Housing. Ah, the eternal nightmare. Rents climbed ever higher. Brooklyn brownstones that had once been cheap were now worth millions. Young people moved farther into Queens or the Bronx or gave up entirely and lived with 4 roommates and 1 bathroom the size of a closet. Real estate developers kept building glass towers for billionaires who often never showed up. Locals joked that Midtown at night was dark not because people were asleep, but because the apartments were empty investments. The 2010s skyline. Speaking of towers, this was the decade of the super talls. Pencil-thin skyscrapers rose along 57th Street known as Billionaires Row. They were so thin and so tall they looked like toothpicks holding up the sky. Prices soared into the hundreds of millions. Developers bragged about amenities like private pools and sky garages, which are exactly what they sound like, parking spots in the clouds. Meanwhile, ordinary New Yorkers wondered how they'd pay next month's rent. National Spotlight Moments New York always finds its way into the national spotlight, whether it tries to or not. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy slammed into the city. Lower Manhattan flooded. The subway shut down for days, tunnels full of seawater. Breezy Point, Queens saw entire blocks of houses destroyed by fire. Suddenly, the city that never sleeps was sitting in the dark, lit only by candles and generators. Sandy was a wake-up call about climate change, though in typical fashion, New Yorkers treated it like an inconvenience. Yes, my apartment is flooded, but I still need to get to work tomorrow. And then, of course, came 2016. The presidential election threw New York into the center of politics once again. Donald Trump, born and raised in Queens, real estate developer turned reality TV star, became president. Many New Yorkers were horrified. Others shrugged because, after all, they had seen him plaster his name on every shiny building for decades. The city that had long tolerated him as a loud sideshow now had to watch him in the Oval Office. The pandemic and then 2020. COVID-19, if 9/11 was the shock of a single day, the pandemic was a long, slow ordeal. New York was hit hard and early. By March, the streets emptied. Times Square looked like a ghost town. Subways rattled by with only a handful of masked passengers. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Refrigerated trucks stood outside to hold the dead. It was grim, surreal, and unrelenting. Yet in typical New York fashion, people found ways to adapt. Every evening at 7 p.m., residents leaned out of windows to clap, cheer, and bang pots for healthcare workers. Restaurants built wooden sheds on sidewalks for outdoor dining, which at first looked temporary and later became permanent, like a strange new species of architecture. Masks became the most common accessory. Broadway shut down for over a year. For a city where theater is both an art and a business, that was unthinkable. Theaters finally reopened in 2021, and audiences returned cautiously, though ticket prices didn't exactly reflect the "we've all been through so much together" spirit. The pandemic also accelerated trends that had already been simmering. People with money left for second homes upstate or in the Hamptons. People without money stayed, struggling with job losses and housing insecurity. New York saw a spike in inequality, which was impressive, since it was already one of the most unequal cities in the country. Recent years, by the mid-2020s, New York was open again. Tourists came back, crowding the sidewalks. The subway, though still unreliable, filled up with commuters. The energy returned, though with new complications: debates about crime, homelessness, housing, climate change. Eric Adams, a former police officer, became mayor in 2022. His campaign promised to balance safety and fairness, though, like all mayors, he quickly discovered that nothing in New York is ever balanced. His critics call him flashy, erratic, more interested in nightlife than governing. His supporters argue he at least shows up where the problems are. Either way, he continues the tradition of mayors being endlessly yelled at from every direction. The eternal contradictions. So what is New York in the 21st century? It is both the richest and poorest city in America, a place where billionaires buy penthouses in the clouds, and delivery workers sleep in overcrowded apartments. A place where tourists line up for cronut hybrids while bodegas still sell coffee for $1. A place where art, fashion, music, and culture thrive, even while rents drive artists away. It is still the city that never sleeps, though sometimes that phrase just means sirens at 3 a.m. It's still magnetic, infuriating, exhausting, and impossible to copy. People complain about it constantly, yet if they leave, they spend the rest of their lives telling everyone else that New York was better back when I lived there. Closing drift, and that brings us softly to the present day. 4 centuries after the Dutch stumbled ashore and traded beads for an island, New York remains what it has always been: crowded, loud, fragile, magnificent. It has burned, flooded, been occupied, bankrupted, attacked, and quarantined, and still somehow it stands. So if you walk through its streets today, past the glass towers, the bodegas, the brownstones, the bridges, you are really walking through centuries of ambition, mistakes, resilience, and irony, a city that doesn't sleep, so that hopefully you can. New York in the 20th century, so it's 1900. New York is no longer a scrappy colonial port. It's a true metropolis. Over 3 million people are packed into the city. Imagine that. An island once traded for a handful of beads, now covered in tenements, factories, and the occasional mansion with chandeliers so heavy they could probably kill a horse if they fell. The skyline is climbing. Steel has arrived. Elevators too. And New York, never a city to resist showing off, begins a race upward. The Flatiron Building goes up in 1902, its thin, triangular shape confusing horses and delighting photographers. Soon after, even taller towers begin to sprout. By the 1910s, the Woolworth Building is dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce, because nothing says religion in America quite like shopping. But beneath all this steel and glass, life for most New Yorkers is less glamorous. Immigrants continue to flood in through Ellis Island. Italians, Jews from Russia and Poland, Greeks, Hungarians, and countless others. They crowd into the Lower East Side, where apartments often lack plumbing, windows, or sanity. Reformers like Jacob Riis publish photographs in How the Other Half Lives, shocking middle-class readers who had apparently never noticed that thousands of people were living in dark, airless rooms the size of closets. The city grows more chaotic by the day. Streetcars rattle, elevated trains cast shadows over avenues, and pushcarts jam entire neighborhoods. The noise alone is exhausting. But New Yorkers, stubborn as ever, keep going. Of course, with crowds come accidents. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire horrified the city. A garment factory packed with young immigrant women caught fire, and locked doors trapped many inside. Over 140 workers died, some jumping from windows to escape the flames. The tragedy finally forced officials to pass safer labor laws. It was a moment where even New York's politicians realized that maybe, just maybe, life was worth more than profit margins. As the decades rolled on, New York became the stage for nearly everything in American life. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s turned uptown into a center of black art, music, and literature. Jazz clubs, poetry readings, paintings. Harlem buzzed with creativity while the rest of the country mostly looked on, slightly bewildered but impressed. Downtown Wall Street ran wild. The 1920s were roaring, and New York roared the loudest. Bankers, brokers, and speculators made fortunes overnight, or at least until 1929 when the stock market crashed. Naturally, it crashed in New York. The ticker tape machines couldn't keep up, fortunes vanished, and suddenly, bread lines stretched through the same streets where millionaires had just been buying diamond cufflinks. During the Great Depression, New York wore both faces. On one hand, people lined up for soup, slept in shacks, and struggled to find work. On the other, massive construction projects reshaped the skyline. The Empire State Building went up in 1931. It was built so fast, and during such a bleak economy, that it was nicknamed the Empty State Building, because no one could afford to rent space inside. Still it stood, a 102-story symbol of stubborn optimism, or stubborn denial, depending how you look at it. Then came World War II. Once again, New York played multiple roles. Troops shipped out from its harbors. Immigrants cheered or wept for the fates of their homelands. And industries churned out supplies. The city was patriotic but also practical. Wall Street, as usual, found ways to profit. After the war, New York emerged stronger than ever. It became not just America's city but the world's. In 1946, the United Nations set up headquarters there, because nothing says global diplomacy like arguing in midtown traffic. Immigrants continued to pour in, now from Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, and beyond. Neighborhoods shifted, cultures mixed, and languages overlapped, and the skyline, still climbing. The Chrysler Building, elegant with its shiny spire, briefly held the crown before the Empire State stole it. Later, in the 1970s, the World Trade Center Twin Towers rose. They weren't universally loved. Many found them bland, like oversized filing cabinets, but they were undeniably tall. And in New York, tall often equals important. But the mid-20th century wasn't all glittering skyscrapers. Crime rose, poverty spread. By the 1970s, the city nearly went bankrupt. Yes, bankrupt. In 1975, New York was so broke it had to beg Washington for help. President Ford initially refused. The infamous headline in the Daily News read, "Ford to city, drop dead," which, to be fair, is not what you want to hear when you're about to shut off the lights on the subway system. Meanwhile, entire neighborhoods were falling apart. Buildings burned in the South Bronx, sometimes because landlords found it cheaper to collect insurance than to fix them. Crime statistics soared. The subways were covered in graffiti, the kind that now sells for thousands at auction, but at the time mostly meant, "Don't ride this train at night." Tourists were warned to stay away. Locals joked that the city's motto was Fear City, and yet, this was also the New York of punk rock, hip-hop, and gritty creativity. The Ramones were blasting in dingy clubs downtown. DJs in the Bronx were mixing beats that would eventually conquer the world. Artists like Andy Warhol turned lofts into studios. The city was broke, filthy, dangerous, and alive. By the 1980s and 90s, things began to shift again. Wall Street returned with a vengeance, fueled by junk bonds and cocaine. Yuppies moved in, demanding wine bars and jogging paths. Crime slowly declined, thanks to a mix of policing, demographics, and the fact that people simply got tired of being mugged all the time. The subway was cleaned up. Times Square, once a carnival of neon sleaze, was Disney-fied into a place where tourists could safely overpay for coffee. By the end of the 20th century, New York had transformed yet again. It was rich, glitzy, international, and still impossible to define. A city of billionaires and beggars, Broadway and back alleys, Wall Street sharks and corner bodega cats, all packed together, all insisting they were the real New York. Let's drift softly now into the 21st century.